The massive starship hung above Earth, like a silver moon that had wandered too close to the planet, and everyone on the surface could see its shadow passing over their cities and their farms and their oceans as it moved without sound through the atmosphere. Queen Sithara of the Veltari Empire stood at the observation deck of her vessel, her compound eyes watching the blue and green world below with something that her species would never admit was curiosity, for the Veltari were above such primitive emotions, or so they believed with every fiber of their ancient civilization. She had ruled 12 star systems for over 300 years, and she had seen countless species rise and fall across the galaxy. But humans were different in a way that she could not quite name, and this uncertainty bothered her more than she would ever confess to her advisors. "Mother, why do we waste our time with these creatures?" asked Princess Kiravel, the youngest of the queens. 7 daughters, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with the impatience of youth, as she stood beside her mother at the great window. The queen turned her tall, elegant head toward her child, and her mandibles clicked softly in what passed for amusement among her kind. "Because the Galactic Concord requires us to observe all emerging species before they are granted membership, and because you need to learn that even the smallest creatures can surprise you, my daughter," she said. Kiravel made a sound of dismissal, her exoskeletal plates shifting with annoyance as she looked down at the planet that seemed so fragile and small from their position in orbit. She was barely 60 years old, which meant she was still an adolescent by Velthari standards, and she had inherited her mother's intelligence, but not yet her patience or her wisdom. The diplomatic mission had been planned for months, with every detail carefully arranged by both human governments and Velthari protocols, and nothing was supposed to go wrong, because the Veltari did not allow things to go wrong. They were a species of order and precision, of calculations and cold logic, and they had built their empire on the foundation of absolute control over every variable in their existence. The human research station orbiting Mars had been chosen as the meeting place because it represented the best of human achievement, a small outpost of science and hope floating in the darkness between worlds. Queen Sithara had agreed to tour the facility with her daughter and a contingent of guards, believing it would be a simple matter of walking through corridors and nodding at human leaders while they spoke words that meant nothing. She did not know that hatred had followed them into the stars. The group called themselves Terra First, and they believed that humanity should never bow to alien masters, that Earth belonged to humans alone, and that any cooperation with extraterrestrial species was a betrayal of everything their ancestors had built. They had spent years planning this moment, planting their agents in positions of trust, smuggling explosives onto the station piece by piece, and waiting for the day when an alien queen would walk into their trap. Marcus Cole knew nothing of this conspiracy as he worked in his laboratory on the station, surrounded by samples and data and the quiet hum of machines that kept him company through the long hours of research. He was a xenobiologist, which meant he studied alien life forms, and he had devoted his entire career to understanding the countless species that filled the galaxy with their strange and wonderful existence. He was not a soldier or a hero, just a scientist with graying hair and tired eyes who had chosen to spend his life among the stars, because Earth had never felt like home to him. The Queen and her entourage moved through the station with the grace of predators who had no natural enemies, their guards forming a protective ring around the royal family, as human dignitaries scrambled to keep pace with their long strides. Princess Kiravel walked beside her mother, her attention wandering to the strange decorations that humans placed on their walls, the photographs and paintings and words that seemed to have no practical purpose whatsoever. She did not understand why any species would waste resources on such things, and she made a mental note to ask one of the human servants about it later, assuming she could tolerate their smell long enough to have a conversation. The first explosion came without warning. One moment there was peace and order and the soft sound of diplomatic conversation, and the next moment there was fire and screaming and the terrible sound of metal tearing itself apart. Queen Cythera felt the floor heave beneath her feet, and her guards immediately surrounded her in a living shield of armored bodies. As alarms began to wail throughout the station, "Kiravel," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos as she searched for her daughter among the smoke and debris. But Kiravel was gone. The second explosion had torn through the corridor where the princess had been walking, separating her from the group and sending her tumbling through a maze of collapsing walls and shattered glass. She tried to run, her young legs carrying her through passages that groaned and buckled around her. But she did not know where she was going, and every turn seemed to lead deeper into the destruction. A beam fell from the ceiling and struck her across the back, cracking her exoskeletal plates and driving her to the floor with a cry of pain that echoed through the empty corridor. She could not move, could not breathe, could only lie there in the darkness as her bioluminescent blood pooled beneath her broken body. The Velthari guards tried to reach her, but their heavy carapaces made it impossible to navigate the unstable debris, and every step they took threatened to bring more of the ceiling down upon their heads. Queen Cythera watched through the flickering security cameras as her daughter lay bleeding in that distant corridor, and for the first time in 300 years, she felt the cold grip of helplessness close around her heart. "We cannot reach her, Majesty," said the captain of her guard, his voice flat with the acceptance of failure that their species considered a virtue. "Then find someone who can," the queen screamed, and every Velthari in the room flinched at the sound of raw emotion tearing through their leader's composure. On the security feed, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame, small and soft and impossibly fragile compared to the destruction that surrounded it. It was a human, moving through the smoke with determined steps, following a sound that pulled at something deep within his chest. Marcus Cole had heard the princess crying, and he had decided to ignore the evacuation orders because he could not walk away from someone who needed help. He did not know that his decision would change the course of galactic history, and he would not have cared if someone had told him, because right now there was only the sound of pain and the simple truth that he could do something about it. The queen watched as this strange creature moved toward her daughter, and something ancient stirred in her chest, something she had no name for, and no frame of reference to understand. All she knew was that a human was about to touch her child, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus Cole pushed through the smoke and the falling debris with his arms raised to protect his face, his lungs burning with every breath as he followed the sound of crying deeper into the destroyed section of the station. He had worked on this station for 5 years, and he knew its corridors the way he knew the lines on his own hands, which meant he could navigate even through the chaos of twisted metal and sparking wires that surrounded him now. The crying grew louder as he turned a corner, and then he saw her. She was unlike anything he had ever seen up close, a creature of elegant angles and shimmering plates, her body built like a work of art that some cosmic sculptor had carved from living crystal and precious metals. But she was also broken. A massive beam had fallen across her back, pinning her to the floor, and the strange luminescent fluid leaking from beneath her plates told him that she was bleeding badly, possibly dying. Hesitate. He had read the briefings about Veltari culture, about their strict rules regarding physical contact, about the complex social hierarchies that governed every aspect of their existence. But none of that mattered right now. Right now there was only a young creature in pain, crying out for help in a language that needed no translation, and Marcus was the only one who could reach her. "Hey there," he said softly as he approached, keeping his voice calm and gentle, despite the fear hammering in his chest. "I am going to help you, okay? Just try to stay still." The princess looked up at him with compound eyes that reflected his face 1,000 times over, and he could see the terror in those alien features, the confusion of a child who did not understand why the universe had suddenly become so cruel. "It hurts," she whispered, her translator rendering her words in a voice that trembled with pain. "I know it does," Marcus said as he knelt beside her, examining the beam and calculating how much force he would need to move it. "But I am going to get you out of here, and then everything is going to be okay." He wrapped his hands around the beam and pulled with all his strength, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against the weight of metal that wanted to crush this young life beneath it. For a terrible moment nothing happened, and Marcus felt despair threatening to overwhelm him. But then he thought about his own daughter back on Earth, about how he would want someone to help her if she was ever in danger, and something broke loose inside him. The beam moved. It was not much, just a few inches, but it was enough for the princess to drag herself forward with a cry of pain that tore at his heart. Marcus let the beam fall and immediately gathered her into his arms, lifting her slight weight against his chest as her blood soaked through his uniform and stained his skin with colors he had no name for. "Put me down," she said weakly, her clawed hands pushing against him, even as her strength failed her. "You cannot touch me. It is forbidden." "I am afraid I do not know much about what is forbidden," Marcus replied, as he began walking toward the emergency shuttles, his arms steady despite the trembling that wanted to take over his body. "But I do know that you are hurt and scared and alone, and I am not going to leave you here." The princess stared at him with those strange and beautiful eyes, and something in her expression shifted from fear to confusion to something that might have been wonder. No one had ever held her like this. Among the Veltari, physical contact was reserved for bonded pairs and for mothers with their young children. And even then, it was measured and brief, a necessary biological function rather than an act of comfort. But this human held her as if she mattered, as if her pain was his pain, as if her survival was the most important thing in the universe. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice growing weaker as blood loss began to take its toll. "Marcus," he said, glancing down at her with a small smile that crinkled the corners of his tired eyes. "My name is Marcus Cole." "Marcus," she repeated, and the words sounded strange in her alien mouth, but also somehow right. The corridor ahead was blocked by debris, and Marcus had to climb over piles of twisted metal while keeping the princess secure in his arms. Every step a battle against exhaustion. Fear. "Talk to me," he said as he navigated the obstacles, worried by the way her bioluminescence was beginning to dim. "Tell me about your home. Tell me about your favorite things. Tell me anything." The princess was silent for a long moment, and Marcus feared she had lost consciousness, but then her voice came soft and dreaming through the smoke. "My home world has 3 suns," she whispered, "and when they set together, the sky turns colors that have no names in any language, and the singing flowers open their petals to catch the last light." "That sounds beautiful," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion that he could not explain. "It is," she agreed, "and there is a garden where my mother used to take me when I was small, before I was old enough to learn the duties of a princess, and we would walk among the crystal trees, and she would tell me stories about the first queens." "Tell me one of those stories," Marcus urged, feeling her grip on his shoulder growing weaker. And so she did. She told him about Queen Vethera, who had united the warring clans of her world through wisdom rather than force, and about Queen Silmoth, who had first reached into the stars and touched the face of an alien god. Marcus listened to every word, asking questions and making sounds of amazement, keeping her awake and focused, even as his own body screamed for rest. He did not know that on the other side of the station, a queen was watching through security cameras with an expression that her species had no word for. He did not know that his simple act of kindness was shattering thousands of years of assumptions about what lesser species were capable of. All he knew was that there was a child in his arms who needed to believe that everything would be okay, and he would walk through fire to make that true. The emergency shuttle bay appeared ahead of them like a promise of salvation, its lights flickering, but still bright enough to guide them home. "We made it," Marcus said, relief flooding through his body as he carried the princess toward the waiting medics and soldiers and diplomats who had gathered at the evacuation point. "Marcus," the princess whispered, her clawed hand rising to touch his face with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Thank you." He looked down at her and smiled, and in that smile was everything that made humanity both terrifying and beautiful. The capacity for violence and the capacity for love, existing side by side in the same fragile package. "You are going to be just fine," he told her. "I promise." And then the Veltari guards appeared, their weapons raised, their eyes cold with suspicion, and something that looked almost like fear. Queen Cythara stood among them, and when she saw the human holding her daughter, covered in royal blood and smiling as if he had done nothing wrong, she felt the foundations of her entire worldview begin to crack. "See, release her," she commanded, and her voice was the voice of empires, of absolute power that had never been questioned. Marcus looked at the alien queen, at the weapons pointed at his chest, at the impossible situation he had somehow stumbled into, and he did not flinch. "She needs medical attention right now," he said calmly, "and once your doctors have taken over, I will be happy to explain everything." The queen stared at this small and fragile creature, and she realized that she had no idea what to do next, because nothing in 300 years of rule had prepared her for a human who would not bow. The silence that followed Marcus's words stretched across the evacuation bay like a living thing, heavy and dangerous and filled with the potential for violence that made everyone afraid to breathe. Queen Cythera had ruled 12 star systems with absolute authority for 3 centuries, and in all that time no one had ever spoken to her with such calm defiance, such complete lack of fear in the face of her power. Her guards shifted restlessly, their weapons humming with energy that could turn this human into ash in less than a heartbeat, waiting for the command that they were certain would come. But the command did not come. Instead, the queen moved forward with slow and measured steps, her compound eyes fixed on the small creature who held her daughter so carefully in his arms. She could see the blood soaking through his uniform, the sacred blood of her youngest child staining this alien flesh, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to destroy him for this violation. Yet her daughter was alive. Kiravel stirred in the human's arms and turned her head to look at her mother, and when she spoke, her voice was weak but clear. "Mother, he saved me," she said. "He carried me through the fire, and he sang to me when I was scared, and he told me stories to keep me awake when all I wanted to do was sleep." The queen stopped, just a few feet away from Marcus, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, and the gentle way he held her child, despite the obvious weight that must have been pulling at his muscles. "You sang to her?" the queen asked, and there was something in her voice that no one had heard before, a crack in the armor of cold detachment that had defined her rule. "She was scared," Marcus replied simply, "and in my experience, scared children respond well to songs and stories, so I did what I could to keep her calm." The queen's mandibles clicked in a pattern that her advisors did not recognize, and she reached out one clawed hand toward her daughter. "Give her to me," she said, and her voice was softer now, almost gentle in a way that made her guards exchange nervous glances. Marcus nodded and carefully transferred the princess into her mother's arms, watching as the alien queen cradled her child with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a creature of such power and coldness. "You should know," Marcus said quietly as he stepped back. that she lost a significant amount of blood, and there may be damage to her exoskeletal plates that will require specialized treatment. The Queen looked at him with those endless compound eyes, and for a moment, Marcus felt like he was falling into an ocean of stars. "You are a doctor?" she asked. "A xenobiologist," he replied. "I study alien life forms, including Velthari physiology, which is why I knew enough to slow the bleeding until proper help could arrive." The Queen turned to her medics and issued rapid commands in her own language, and they rushed forward to take the princess and carry her to the medical shuttle that waited at the edge of the bay. Then she turned back to Marcus, and everyone in the room held their breath. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked, and her voice had grown cold again, though Marcus thought he could hear something fragile beneath the ice. "I saved a child," he answered, meeting her gaze without flinching. "That is all I understand, and that is all that matters to me." "You touched a member of the royal family," the Queen said. "You held her in your arms and carried her through the station, while her blood covered your body. And among my people, these acts are considered violations of the highest order." Marcus felt his heart sink, but he did not look away. "I did not know your customs," he admitted, "and even if I had known, I would have done the same thing, because your daughter was dying, and I was the only one who could reach her. And that is what confuses me," the Queen said, stepping closer until she towered over him like a mountain of crystal and shadow. "Because you had no reason to help her." "She was scared and hurt and alone," Marcus said. "That was reason enough." The Queen studied him in silence, and Marcus could feel the weight of her attention pressing down on him like a physical force. She had conquered worlds and commanded fleets that darkened the skies of 100 planets, and she had never encountered anything quite like this small and fragile human who stood before her without fear. "Your own people caused this attack," she said finally. "Humans planted the bombs that nearly killed my daughter, and yet another human risked his life to save her. How do you explain this contradiction?" Marcus thought about the question carefully before answering. "Humans are complicated," he said. "We are capable of terrible cruelty and incredible kindness, sometimes in the same breath, and I cannot explain why some of my people would commit such an act of violence." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with sadness. "All I can tell you is that those people do not represent all of humanity, just as I hope your conquerors and warriors do not represent all Velthari." The Queen made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was harsh and cold. "You presume to lecture me about my own people?" "No," Marcus replied. "I only share what I have observed, because in my studies of your species, I have seen soldiers and scientists and artists and dreamers, and I refuse to believe that any species can be defined by the worst of its members." The Queen fell silent again, and something shifted in the depths of her compound eyes. She had lived for 500 years, and traveled to more worlds than most species could imagine, and she had always believed that the galaxy was a simple place, divided clearly between the strong and the weak, the civilized and the primitive. But this human did not fit into any of her categories. He was weak in body, but strong in spirit, primitive in technology, but sophisticated in compassion, and she did not know what to do with a creature who could not be labeled or dismissed. "What is your name?" she asked, and the question surprised everyone, including herself. "Marcus Cole," he answered. "Marcus Cole," she repeated, tasting the alien syllables on her tongue. "You have created a situation that has no precedent in Veltari history, and I do not yet know how to resolve it." "I am not asking for anything," Marcus said. "I only did what any decent person would do, and I expect no reward or recognition." The Queen stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something that no one in the room had ever seen her do before. She lowered her head in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but something close to it. "You will remain on this station until I decide what is to be done," she said, "and you will be treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. But you will not leave until I have spoken with my advisors." Marcus nodded his acceptance, knowing that he had no choice in the matter. As the Queen turned to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at him over her shoulder. "My daughter called you by name," she said quietly, "and she has never done that with anyone outside our family, not once in 60 years of life." Then she was gone, leaving Marcus standing alone in the evacuation bay, surrounded by humans and aliens who looked at him with expressions of wonder and fear, and something that might have been hope. He had no idea what he had started, but he knew that his life would never be the same again. The days that followed the attack moved slowly for everyone on the station, as repair crews worked to fix the damaged sections, and diplomats struggled to contain the political disaster that threatened to engulf both species. Queen Sithara spent most of her time in the medical bay where her daughter recovered, watching as Velthari physicians worked to repair the damage to Kiravel's exoskeletal plates. The princess grew stronger with each passing day, but she spoke often of the human who had saved her, asking questions about his species that the queen could not answer. "Why did he sing to me?" Kiravel asked one evening, her bioluminescence glowing softly in the dim light of the recovery room. "I do not know," the queen admitted, and the words felt strange on her tongue, because she was not accustomed to admitting ignorance. "He held my hand when I was scared," the princess continued, "and he did not let go, even when I dug my claws into his flesh. Just kept talking to me in that soft voice." The queen looked at her daughter and saw something new in those young compound eyes, something that worried her more than any enemy fleet or political crisis. "You admire him," she said, and it was not a question. "I do not understand him," Kiravel replied, "and everything I do not understand makes me curious. Is that not what you always taught me?" The queen had no answer for that, so she simply touched her daughter's face gently and left the medical bay to walk through the corridors of the station. She found herself returning again and again to the section where Marcus Cole was being kept, drawn by a curiosity that she could not explain or suppress. The human had been given comfortable quarters and access to everything he needed, treated as a guest just as she had commanded, and yet he did not seem to care about the luxury that surrounded him. Instead, he spent his time reading scientific papers and watching educational programs and exercising in the small gym that had been provided for his use. The queen watched him through the security feeds, studying his movements and expressions as if he were a puzzle that she needed to solve. She had conquered entire civilizations without losing a moment of sleep, but this single human kept her awake at night with questions that had no easy answers. Finally, on the 5th day after the attack, she decided to visit him herself. Marcus was sitting at a small desk when the door to his quarters opened, reading something on a tablet that he quickly set aside when he saw who had entered. "Your Majesty," he said, rising to his feet with a respectful nod, "I was not expecting you." "Sit down," the queen commanded, though her voice was gentler than she intended. "I did not come here to receive your courtesies." Marcus sat back down, and the queen took the chair across from him, her tall form folding gracefully into it. Position that seemed almost casual. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the alien monarch and the human scientist, two creatures from opposite ends of the galaxy, trying to understand what connected them. "My daughter asks about you constantly," the queen said finally. "She wants to know everything about human culture and history and customs, and she becomes frustrated when I cannot answer her questions." "She is curious," Marcus replied with a small smile, "and curiosity is a good quality in a young person, regardless of species." "She has never been curious about lesser species before," the queen said, and then she paused, realizing what she had just revealed. "Lesser species," Marcus repeated, and there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired acceptance. "That is how we think of you," the queen admitted. "Your civilization is young and fragile, your technology is primitive, Your lifespans are painfully short, and you have not yet proven yourselves worthy of respect. And yet one of us saved your daughter, Marcus said quietly. The Queen felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in centuries. Yes, she said, and that is what I cannot understand. She leaned forward, her compound eyes studying his face with an intensity that would have made most creatures tremble. I have analyzed your action from every possible angle, she continued. I have considered political motivation, personal ambition, psychological manipulation, and survival instinct. But none of these explanations fit. Because there is nothing to explain, Marcus said. I heard someone crying in pain, and I went to help, that is all. But why? The Queen pressed, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. You owed us nothing. Your own people caused the disaster, and helping my daughter put your life at risk for no benefit whatsoever. Marcus was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When I was a young man, he said slowly, my daughter got sick, very sick, and for a while we did not know if she would survive. He paused, and the Queen saw pain flicker across his soft human features. A stranger saved her life, he continued, a doctor who worked through the night when he could have gone home to his family, who refused to give up even when everyone else told him it was hopeless. He looked at the Queen with those strange eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds within their depths. I asked him afterward why he had done it, why he had sacrificed so much for a child he did not know. And do you know what he said? The Queen shook her head slowly. He said that he had become a doctor because he wanted to help people, and that helping people was its own reward, and that if he needed any other reason, then he had chosen the wrong profession. Marcus smiled at the memory, and the Queen felt that strange sensation in her chest grow stronger. That man taught me something important, Marcus said. He taught me that the measure of a person is not what they do when they have something to gain, but what they do when they have nothing to gain at all. The Queen sat in silence, processing his words with a mind that had calculated the fates of billions. We have a concept in Veltari culture, she said finally, called the balance of obligation. When someone does something for you, you must do something of equal value in return. And until that balance is achieved, you are bound to them. I do not want anything from you, Marcus said. I already told you that. I know, the Queen replied, and that makes the debt even heavier, because how can I repay someone who wants nothing? She rose from her chair and moved toward the window, looking out at the stars that burned cold and distant in the void. I have ruled my empire by the principles of calculation and control, she said. Every action has a purpose, every gift has a price, every kindness is a tool for manipulation. She turned back to face him, and Marcus was startled to see something that looked almost like vulnerability in her alien features. But you have shown me that there is another way to exist, she continued, a way that makes no logical sense, and yet somehow produces results that all my calculations could never achieve. It is called compassion, Marcus said gently, and it is one of the few things that makes existence bearable. The Queen nodded slowly, as if she were learning a new language. Compassion, she repeated. I will need to study this concept further. And for the first time in 500 years, the most powerful ruler in 12 star systems admitted that she had something to learn from a species she had dismissed as primitive and worthless. It was a small moment, a single crack in the walls of her certainty, but it was enough to change everything that would come after. The great chamber of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction, a vast amphitheater carved from the heart of an ancient asteroid, where representatives from 1,000 species gathered to decide the fate of worlds. Holographic displays floated above each delegation, translating words and gestures into 100 different languages, while security drones hummed softly through the artificial atmosphere. The topic of discussion was humanity, News of the terrorist attack had spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, and species who had never heard of Earth now debated whether humans were too dangerous to be allowed among the stars. "They nearly killed a Velthari princess," declared Ambassador Crothax of the Mineral Collective, his crystalline body pulsing with angry red light. "And this is not an isolated incident, for we have all heard stories of human violence and destruction. They wage wars against each other constantly," added the last line there. "Representative from the Vethnar consensus, a creature of flowing liquid metal, and their history is written in blood and fire. How can we trust such a species with access to interstellar technology?" The chamber erupted with voices and sounds that expressed agreement, and for a terrible moment it seemed that humanity's future among the stars would end before it truly began. But then Queen Sithara rose from her seat, and the chamber fell silent. She was the most powerful ruler in attendance, commander of 12 star systems, and the largest military fleet in the known galaxy. And when she spoke, every species listened. "I did not come here to defend humanity," she began, her voice carrying across the vast space with perfect clarity. "For there is much about them that troubles me, and I understand your concerns." The other delegates nodded and murmured their approval, expecting her to call for sanctions or isolation, or perhaps even military. "Their history is violent," the Queen continued, "and their technology is primitive, and they have not yet learned to control the darker aspects of their nature." She paused, and every eye and sensor in the chamber focused on her with intense attention. "But I have seen something in them that changes everything," she said. "Something that I believe none of us have witnessed in 10,000 years of galactic civilization." She raised one clawed hand, and the holographic display above her delegation flickered to life with security footage from the Mars station. The assembled species watched as a small human figure moved through smoke and fire, lifted a beam from a broken alien child, gathered that child in his arms, and carried her through corridors of destruction while speaking words of comfort. "This human had no reason to help my daughter," the Queen said as the footage played. "His own people had caused the attack, and saving her put his life in danger for no benefit whatsoever." She turned to face the assembly, and her compound eyes swept across the gathered delegates like searchlights. "I asked him why he did it," she continued, "and his answer was so simple that I almost dismissed it as the ramblings of a primitive mind." The chamber was completely silent now, every being leaning forward to hear what the mighty Veltari Queen would say next. "He told me that she was scared and alone and hurt, and that was reason enough." Queen Sithara let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "We have traveled the stars for 10,000 years, she said. "We have catalogued 1,000,000 species and built empires that span galaxies, and we have written laws that govern the behavior of countless civilizations." Her voice grew stronger, filled with an emotion that her species rarely displayed. "And in all that time, we have never once encountered a species that would risk everything to save a stranger's child, simply because she was afraid." She stepped forward, moving to the center of the chamber, where everyone could see her clearly. "We call ourselves civilized," she declared. "We pride ourselves on our technology and our wisdom and our ancient cultures. But what is civilization worth if we have forgotten how to care for one another?" The delegates stirred uncomfortably, unused to such passion from the cold and calculating Velthari. "Humanity is not perfect," the Queen acknowledged. "They are chaotic and contradictory and young, and they will make mistakes that we will need to guide them through." She raised her head high, and her bioluminescence blazed with a light that none of her people had ever seen before. "But they possess something we have forgotten, something that we may have never truly had, and they call it compassion." She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of every delegation in the chamber. "Believe compassion is the most powerful force in the universe," she said, "more powerful than any weapon or fleet or empire. because it is the only force that can turn an enemy into a friend. The chamber remained silent as the Queen's words echoed through the vast space. My daughter survived because a human chose to help her, she continued, and in the days since then, I have watched her change in ways that I never expected. Her voice softened, becoming almost gentle. She asks questions now about other species and other cultures, and she speaks of understanding rather than conquest. And she has begun to believe that the galaxy might be a place of connection rather than competition. The Queen looked out at the assembled delegates, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that sounded almost like hope. If one act of human kindness can transform a Velthari princess, imagine what it might do for the rest of us. Her place among her delegation, but she did not sit down. I call for a vote, she announced, and I ask that humanity be granted full membership in the Galactic Concord, with the Velthari Empire as their sponsor. The chamber exploded with noise as delegates argued and debated and processed this unexpected development. For hours the discussion continued, with some species supporting the Queen's proposal and others opposing it. But gradually the balance shifted as more and more delegates considered her words. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Humanity was welcomed into the Galactic Concord, not because of their technology or their resources, or their potential as allies, but because a single human had shown the galaxy what compassion looked like. Years later, when historians wrote about the moment that changed galactic history, they always mentioned Marcus Cole. He had returned to his work as a xenobiologist, declining offers of fame and political power, preferring instead to continue his quiet research among the stars. Reporters and diplomats often asked him about his experience, wanting to know how it felt to have changed the course of interstellar relations. I just did what anyone would do, he always said with a shrug and a small smile. But the Velthari knew better. They had studied 1,000 species across 1,000,000 worlds, cataloged every form of life and intelligence that the galaxy had to offer, and they understood something that Marcus himself seemed unable to accept. What he had done was not common at all. It was rare and precious and beautiful, a glimpse of what sentient beings could become if they chose connection over fear. Princess Kiravel never forgot the human who had carried her through fire and sung to her in the darkness. She grew to become one of the greatest queens in Velthari history, known throughout the galaxy for her wisdom and compassion. Credited Marcus Cole with showing her a different way to exist, and Queen Sithara, who had ruled with cold calculation for 500 years, found herself changed in ways she could not fully explain. She began to seek understanding rather than dominance, cooperation rather than conquest, and her empire flourished in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. All because one small human had heard a child crying and decided to help. The stars are vast and cold and filled with dangers that most species cannot imagine. But they are also filled with moments of unexpected beauty. And sometimes, in the darkness between worlds, a single act of kindness can light a fire that never goes out. This is what humanity brought to the galaxy, and it was worth more than all the weapons and technology and resources that any species had ever possessed. It was hope. And hope, as the Velthari learned, was the greatest gift of all.